Professor Edgar, good morning. Professor Peterson, good morning, and thanks for your time. And like we've been saying, we have a lot of development happening in terms of complex living. We're looking at estates, we're looking at townhouses that are mushrooming all over the country. But what are we doing about people who are genuinely homeless, about the poor, like Deson has just been talking about there to Abahlali Basim Jandolo, talking about the poor who genuinely have no place to live?
Good morning. Thank you for having me on the program. Well, the government is doing a lot because all of those people technically fall in the category that they qualify for free public housing in the form of what we call RDP housing or BNG housing. The problem, of course, is that we are talking about so many families and households that it is impossible for the government to keep up with the level of demand. And of course, if you live in those circumstances, you can't wait for when your turn arrives because you're on a waiting list that might take 10, 15 years to resolve itself. So you have to act. And often what we see is that these occupations are an act of desperation because people are determined to try and improve their position, either in relation to work opportunities or to at least get their children closer to decent schools.
Prof, many might disagree with you when you say that government has been doing its bit, it has been successfully delivering housing. We also know that it's been rife with corruption, the process as well. I mean, how do we work all of this out, and how do we, obviously it's not moving fast enough, even if they are moving fast?
I think it's fairly clear from various reports by the government itself, whether it's its Treasury Department or the Attorney General, that the system has been subject to large-scale corruption in different parts of the country, including very poor construction that was provided by service providers that were not adequately managed and so forth. But be that as it may, we still see that since 1994 that there's been more than 4.5 million subsidies processed and about 3.5 million housing units have been provided. If you put this in an international perspective, there's only one country in the world that exceeds that, and that's China, because obviously it's a much bigger country. And the capacity for the state to deliver at scale is of a different order of magnitude. But most other middle-income countries don't have a program that provides a full house with internal infrastructure and so forth. So part of the problem is that the package of response that the state provides is expensive, and it takes a long time to provide that to everyone. So even though the system is flawed and there's a whole range of problems and it doesn't keep up with demand, it would be inaccurate to say that the government hasn't done anything.
Prof, many ordinary South Africans might be asking the question or saying we have so much land that seems to be vacant, that nobody seems to be doing anything with. I mean, if you're driving from Joburg to Durban, you might actually notice bare land. Even if you drive in Johannesburg itself, if you're driving sort of the West Rand going towards Lanseria and going towards the northwest as well, there seems to be land available. Explain to us sort of what's the complexities of that kind of converting land like that. Who owns it? Why can't we buy it from them? Why can't we actually build houses for people who don't have, then they don't have to live in squalor?
No, absolutely. I mean, it boils down to, again, a question of affordability. So one, there's two categories of land in broad terms. One is some land is owned by the state itself, but it could also be different parts of the state. So what we know is that when municipalities try and access land that is owned by a national department, whether it be defense or it might be public works, or they want to access land owned by one of the parastatals like PRASA or Transnet and so forth, they simply cannot access that land. And the reason is that often for the national departments, or especially the parastatals, those land parcels form part of their balance sheet. And so the argument is they can't simply just hand it over to municipalities for housing because that is an asset on their balance sheet and it will ruin their position to access credit on the financial markets. In the case of private land, of course, private landowners will always try and get the highest possible price for any land transaction. And the issue for the state is that they are able to get land, but the land is usually in a very poorly located setting. But because the way the state procures land is they use the housing instruments. In other words, when they're going to provide RDP housing, the subsidies get bundled in the way to both get the land, build the housing, and provide the infrastructure. They then tend to go for the cheapest possible land, which is in the middle of nowhere or right at the outskirts of the city. Any land that is located in an economically advantageous position is expensive. and the state generally won't have the resources to purchase that land at market value. So then the question might arise, so why doesn't the state simply annex the land, or why doesn't it use various instruments in its disposal to appropriate that land? The reason for that is because it leads to litigation. The landowners, it's not a simple act where a municipality can say that that land is well located, we want to use it for housing, and so we will appropriate it. They have to go through a whole number of legal hoops. And the cost and the time associated for that is often something that most municipalities don't see themselves getting engaged with. So there's a whole host of problems. Also, land that people see that is readily available tends not to be serviced. So before you can move people onto land, you've got to first provide the internal infrastructure, the underground infrastructure, for people to be able to settle there or for businesses to operate from there. So again, it comes back to a question of, if you look at the limited resources, the timeframes involved in planning any housing or human settlement development, you can't simply just willy-nilly get people to access any parcel of land and expect that the state will be able to provide both infrastructure and housing.
All right,
so indeed, it is complex.
Thanks very much for that. Well, if like me, you've wondered why that land isn't being used to provide houses, well, Professor Edgar Petersen there explaining some of it. He's the Director of African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town.